Have you ever felt this kind of persistent gnawing suspicion that something is just deeply wrong with how society treats men?
Like a feeling you aren't really allowed to say out loud.
Yeah, exactly. Like you look at the cultural narrative and then you compare it to the reality you see every single day, and you just think, the math just isn't adding up here.
Right, something feels off.
Well, if you've ever felt that way, you're going to want to pull up a chair, get comfortable, and listen very, very closely today. Welcome to the deep dive.
We have a really intense one today.
We do. Our mission today is a massive, really incisive, and honestly fascinating review of this highly provocative new ebook.
It's called Pig Class, right?
Yeah, Pig Class, Feminism's Superior Citizens, and it's by Conrad Riker. And look, let me just tell you right now, hit that like and subscribe button, because by the time we finish exploring these sources today, you are absolutely going to want to head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
Oh, for sure. You'll want to get your own copy to see this raw data for yourself.
Exactly, because it's incredibly dense.
It's very data heavy. I mean, the central thesis we are unpacking today is that our modern institutions, which, historically operated under completely different frameworks, have been systematically captured.
Captured by specific feminist and Marxist ideologies, right?
Exactly. And the result of this capture, according to the author's really extensive research, is a society that systematically, legally, and culturally subordinates men.
All while, explicitly claiming to be fighting for equality.
Right. And we're going to meticulously unpack how the text builds this case. We're
Right.
looking at historical timelines, biological arguments, and the exact legal mechanisms he points out.
But right here at the top, I need to say something directly to you, the listener.
Yeah, the disclaimer is really important here.
It is. We are looking at some incredibly charged data today. I mean, this book touches on intense political themes. It intersects with both left-wing and right-wing talking points.
It takes aim at some serious third-rail topics in our culture.
It really does. So just to be completely clear, our job today isn't to tell you if the author is right or wrong, or, to take a side.
Right. We were not endorsing these viewpoints.
No, not endorsing, and we aren't condemning them either. Our role is strictly to act as impartial guides.
We are just here to crack open these arguments and lay out the statistics.
Exactly. We'll present the ideas exactly as they are in the original source material and let you evaluate them for yourself.
Because our goal here is synthesis and analysis. We want to look at the how and the why behind the claims.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The author really doesn't hold back, starting right with that title.
Oh, Pig Class. It's a heavy reference.
Yeah, he borrows that concept directly from George Orwell's novel Animal Farm.
Right, where the revolutionary pigs declare that all animals are equal, but then once they take power, they quietly amend the rules.
They amend them to say that some animals are more equal than others.
Exactly. And the text uses this allegory to describe modern women under the current iteration of feminism.
Arguing that a framework has basically been built where they function as a class of superior citizens.
Right, entitled to every benefit, protection, and privilege of society, while simultaneously maintaining this perpetual, unassailable victim status.
And to lay the groundwork for this, the book immediately pivots away from the highly publicized wage gap.
Which we hear about all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
And instead, he focuses our attention on what he calls the death gap.
Yeah, the occupational mortality statistics provided here, they form the absolute bedrock of the book's economic argument.
And the numbers are, they're kind of shocking.
Staggering. Citing the health and safety executive in the UK, the text points out that men account for 96% of all workplace fatalities.
Wait, 96%.
96%. And moving to the US, citing Bureau of Labor Statistics data, that number is 92.7%.
That is just, that's massive.
And what's crucial to understand here is that this isn't an anomaly. It's not just one bad year.
Right.
It is a consistent structural reality across virtually all Western industrialized nations.
So the argument is really highlighting this profound cultural cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Mainstream discourse and corporate media focus so intensely on the lack of female CEOs in Fortune 500 boardrooms.
Right, the glass ceiling.
But there is a deafening silence, what the author actually calls a grotesque hypocrisy, regarding the millions of human beings literally sacrificed to keep the gears of industrial civilization turning.
I honestly had to read this part 3 times to make sure my brain was grasping the scale.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And the book leans heavily on this concept originally coined by Dr. Warren Farrell called the glass cellar.
Right, the contrast to the glass ceiling.
Yeah, the glass cellar is this invisible floor beneath which society deposits its most dangerous, physically demanding, dirty, and deadly occupations.
We're talking about commercial deep-sea fishing, underground sewage maintenance, high-voltage electrical grid repair in freezing storms.
Superfund toxic waste cleanup. These are the jobs that form the physical backbone of modern life.
And they are performed almost exclusively by men.
And to illustrate this disparity, the text draws a really visceral contrast. It points to the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico back in April 2010,
Right, where 11 workers were killed on that oil rig.
burned alive in a massive blowout, drowned, or literally vaporized in the fireball.
And every single one of those workers was a man.
Exactly. And according to the data in the book, they were earning between $40,000 and $60,000 a year to do one of the most hazardous jobs on the planet.
And then the book contrasts the cultural reaction to those horrific deaths with a media event that happened around the exact same time.
Oh, the Jennifer Lawrence thing.
Yeah, the massive global outrage when Hollywood actress Jennifer Lawrence discovered via that Sony email hack that she was paid less than her male co-stars in American Hustle.
It is a really jarring comparison when you put them side by side.
It is. The text uses it to point out the mechanics of our cultural empathy.
Right, a multimillionaire complaining about missing out on a few extra millions is treated by the media and the feminist establishment as this profound victim of systemic oppression.
Meanwhile, the men burned to ash on an oil rig for a fraction of that money are entirely ignored by those exact same advocacy organizations.
It's just wild. And the author continues building this pattern, bringing up the Upper Big Branch mine disaster in West Virginia.
Also in 2010, 29 miners killed in an explosion, all men.
And the text notes that coal mining is a 95% male industry, with a fatality rate nearly 6 times the national average.
Then he zooms out globally, citing the International Labor Organization. They estimate 2.78 million workers die annually from occupational accidents and diseases.
2.78 million.
Yeah. Now, the text notes the exact gender breakdown for the global data isn't meticulously tracked, which the author argues is an intentional blind spot.
Interesting.
But available regional data suggests men constitute between 80 and 90% of these fatalities globally.
So we're literally talking about millions of male deaths annually just to keep the world running.
Exactly. Now, here is where the book dissects the standard counter-argument.
Because when these numbers come up, the usual response is, well, men simply choose these dangerous professions because they pay more. Right.
Right. The narrative frames this as a byproduct of male privilege and aggressive economic ambition.
But the text completely dismantles that idea.
It does. The author argues that when you actually run the numbers and adjust for mortality risk, continuous hours worked, and extreme hazards, the so-called gender pay gap virtually disappears.
And in some metrics, it actually reverses.
Exactly. The core analysis here is about the illusion of choice.
Right. Like they aren't just choosing to risk their lives for fun.
The text argues that men do not accept a 90+% mortality risk out of some inherent privilege. They accept it out of absolute crushing economic necessity.
So the very same economic system that feminist theory condemns as a patriarchy designed to benefit men often offers these specific men absolutely no alternative path.
No alternative to fulfill their societal mandate to provide for their families.
In this framework, male disposability isn't just a bug in the system. It is the fundamental load-bearing architecture of civilization itself.
That's his main economic point.
I see the argument, but I want to push back on this a bit, or at least, introduce a way to test this logic.
I always hear it.
The author is pointing us to this glass cellar. It's like looking at a massive skyscraper, right? The executives are in the penthouse, and the maintenance crew is down in the sub-basement dealing with the high-voltage lines.
And the raw sewage, yeah.
But isn't it true that historically men built these industries from the ground up? They designed the rigs, sunk the mine shafts, laid the grids.
Right, they created the infrastructure.
So is this current disparity actually evidence of systemic feminist oppression? Or is it just the brutal, lingering reality of an industrial infrastructure that men built, and therefore they still predominantly staff it?
That is a critical distinction to make,
Yeah.
and it leads directly into the next major argument of the text.
Okay, how does he answer that?
The author would say it is not merely a lingering artifact of the Industrial Revolution. He asserts that this male disposability is rooted much deeper.
Deeper how? Like biology.
Yes. In our biology, our evolutionary history, and our ancient moral customs, long before modern feminism was ever conceived.
So feminism didn't create the disposability.
According to the text, feminism didn't create it, it simply observed it, captured it, and weaponized it.
Okay, so to prove this historical precedent, the book takes us all the way back to the year 1852.
The sinking of the HMS Birkenhead.
Yeah, this is a wild piece of history. The ship hits a hidden rock off the coast of South Africa. It's carrying British troops, their families, civilians.
And the ship is going down fast.
Really fast. And the captain issues a specific order. Women and children to the lifeboats first.
Which we think of as standard now, but this was a defining moment.
Right. Of the 643 people aboard, 193 survived. Every single woman and child lived.
Meanwhile, 438 male soldiers were ordered to stand at attention on the deck as the ship literally broke apart and sank beneath their feet.
Knowing with absolute certainty they were going to drown or be eaten by sharks.
And this event birthed what became known as the Birkenhead Drill.
And it rapidly became the gold standard of civilized chivalric conduct in the Western world.
The author uses this not just as a historical anecdote, but as the genesis point of a codified legal standard.
How so? Like, how does a shipwreck become a law?
The text traces how that informal moral custom, the expectation of sacrificing male lives to ensure female survival, evolved directly into modern international law.
Oh, wow.
We are directed to look at the Geneva Conventions. Specifically, Article 76 of Additional Protocol I explicitly mandates that women shall be the object of special respect and special protection.
So it's literally written into the rules of war.
Precisely. And Additional Protocol 2 requires identical protections in non-international conflict.
The legal framework of international conflict inherently designates men as the default protectors or the default combatants.
And women as the protected class. The book observes the modern application of this.
Right, like when cameras roll in a modern conflict zone, you see women and children being ushered to safety across borders, treated as victims deserving immediate assistance.
Meanwhile, fleeing military-age males are pulled aside, interrogated as potential combatants, barred from leaving, or forcibly conscripted.
But the author goes even further than just law. He says this preference for female welfare isn't just a social construct.
No, he argues it's biological.
Right. It's not just patriarchal conditioning that we learn from old shipwrecks. He argues it is a biological instinct screaming through our neurons.
And to back this up, the text brings in the research of Dr. Alice Eagley.
The psychologist, right?
Yes. She rigorously documented a phenomenon she termed the women are wonderful effect. And the text emphasizes she isn't some fringe commentator. Her research is mainstream, peer-reviewed psychology.
And what did her findings show?
They consistently show that both sexes, men and women alike, hold unconscious, deeply ingrained positive biases toward women.
The author bolsters this point with a massive 2016 meta-analysis conducted by the University of Edinburgh, published in the British Journal of Psychology.
Right. This meta-analysis aggregated 36 different studies, specifically looking at sex differences in helping behavior.
And pulling together that much data led to this inescapable conclusion. Both men and women display a significantly greater willingness to help women in distress than they do to help men in identical distress.
This empathy gap crosses cultural boundaries. It even appears in children who are too young to have been heavily socialized by media.
So the mechanism here is evolutionary psychology.
Exactly. The text explains that evolution shaped human psychology to protect the more reproductively valuable sex.
Because one man can theoretically father countless children, but a woman's reproductive capacity is biologically bottlenecked.
So tribal survival depended on prioritizing female safety. The author's point is that you cannot simply rewire 4 million years of survival instinct with a college sociology seminar.
And the book points out how this biological empathy gap plays out in massive systemic ways today that we just completely accept as normal.
Like the selective service system in the United States.
The military draft. Every 18-year-old male is required by law to register. If you don't, it's a felony.
You can face 5 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, and you permanently lose access to federal student aid and employment.
While women face absolutely no equivalent obligation, they receive the full suite of constitutional benefits without the ultimate burden of potential forced conscription.
The text also points to the horrific disparities in suicide statistics as evidence of this empathy gap in action.
Yeah, the suicide stats are really rough. Men commit suicide at 3 to 5 times the rate of women across Western nations.
And the author posits a thought experiment here. If any other demographic group were dying by their own hand at that astronomical rate, it would be treated as an unparalleled national health emergency.
Oh, absolutely. There would be telethons, massive federal funding, endless media coverage.
But because the victims are predominantly men, the cultural and institutional response is essentially silence.
Okay, here's where my brain hits a snag with the author's logic, though.
What's the snag?
If this empathy gap, this innate urge to protect women and view male life as expendable, is literally wired into our neurons over millions of years of evolution, how can the book reasonably blame modern feminism for it?
That's a very fair question.
Right. Aren't feminist activists just playing the hand that human biology dealt them? If society is naturally wired to care more about women's well-being, is this really an ideological conspiracy, or is it just nature taking its course?
The author's counter to that specific critique is found in his analysis of institutional capture. He does not blame feminism for the underlying biological instinct. He admits that would be absurd.
Okay, so what is he blaming them for?
What he blames them for is systematically constructing a vast ideological and bureaucratic apparatus that explicitly exploits that biological instinct.
All while hypocritically claiming that their goal is to dismantle traditional gender roles.
Exactly. The argument is that they utilize Marxist organizational tactics to quietly seize the levers of institutional power.
Ensuring that this ancient biological bias was codified into modern bureaucratic policy, completely insulating themselves from democratic accountability. So if this ideological capture started as a theory, how did it actually happen? Because the timeline he lays out for this is absolutely wild.
He traces the literal playbook for this capture all the way back to an Italian Marxist thinker named Antonio Gramsci.
Who was sitting in one of Mussolini's prison cells in the 1930s.
Yes. Gramsci wrote extensively about the theory of cultural hegemony. The core idea is that in a developed Western society, you don't start a revolution by storming the Capitol with guns.
You do it through the slow, patient, methodical seizure of the institutions that shape public consciousness.
The universities, the media, the church, the legal bureaucracies.
Then the text jumps to 1967, where a German radical named Rudi Dutschke translated Gramsci's theories into an explicit, actionable strategy.
A strategy he called the Long March through the institutions.
And the author argues that early feminist operatives essentially took notes on this Marxist playbook and executed a master battle plan.
The text maps out the timeline of this long march very clearly, showing how theory became reality.
The first major institutional beachhead, according to the book, was established in 1961.
When President John F. Kennedy created the Commission on the Status of Women, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt.
Now, on the surface, this looks completely innocuous.
Right, but the author argues this established a dangerous political precedent. It formalized the treatment of women as a distinct, monolithically oppressed class that required special, dedicated federal advocacy and resources.
And then less than a decade later, in 1970, San Diego State University launched the very first women's studies program.
And the text characterizes these early programs not as centers of objective, rigorous academic inquiry, but as literal manufacturing plants for trained activists equipped with absolute ideological certainty.
Right. And then the real institutional weapon drops in 1972 with the passage of Title IX.
Which is a huge turning point in the book.
The author points out how the mechanism of this law shifted radically. It was originally sold to the American public as a simple, fair way to ensure equal funding for women's collegiate sports.
But once the bureaucracy got hold of it, it rapidly mutated. It became a massive, sweeping federal mandate dictating hiring practices, firing practices.
And eventually, the entire protocol for how sexual assault allegations were handled on college campuses.
Completely bypassing standard legal due process.
The book goes into deep detail on the capture of academia itself, explaining exactly how a field of study is ideologically sealed.
Citing the American Sociological Association, in 1970, the ASA had virtually no dedicated feminist scholarship.
By 1990, entire massive sections of the association were dedicated strictly to gender studies.
And the author explains the mechanism of what he calls peer review cartels.
Yeah, let's explain how a peer review cartel actually works, because that term gets thrown around a lot.
Absolutely. So the mechanism of academic publishing relies on peer review. You submit a paper, and a panel of experts in your field reviews it to ensure it is methodologically sound before it is published.
Okay, standard practice.
Right. But the text argues that feminist academics successfully populated these review panels entirely with ideological allies.
So the mechanism of the cartel is simple. They only cite each other's work to boost their academic ranking.
They only approve papers that conform to the presupposed theory of male oppression.
And crucially, they reject any paper, regardless of its data quality, that questions their ideological framework, citing methodological flaws.
Exactly. So the public, looking from the outside, just sees a wall of peer-reviewed scientific consensus, completely unaware that the filter itself is ideologically rigged.
And the book shows exactly what happens if you try to bypass that filter or dissent on a campus.
It brings up the case of Dr. Janice Fiamengo at the University of Ottawa in March of 2013.
She was a professor attempting to deliver a lecture on men's issues.
And the mechanism of suppression was blunt. Feminist protesters pulled the fire alarms, they flooded the lecture hall, shouted her down with megaphones, and physically shut the event down.
And the key detail the author notes is that the university administration did absolutely nothing to intervene or protect academic freedom.
Just let it happen.
But I have to say, the most hilarious yet terrifying proof the book offers regarding this academic corruption is the grievance studies affair that happened between 2017 and 2018.
Oh, that is a highly pivotal example in the text.
3 academics, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, decided to rigorously test the integrity of these peer-reviewed feminist journals.
They authored 20 deliberately absurd, completely fabricated, and methodologically nonsensical papers and submitted them for publication.
These papers were insane. One of them actually took massive passages of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, completely rewrote them, replacing the original targets with men and using feminist buzzwords, and submitted it.
It's unbelievable.
Another paper suggested that heterosexual men should be encouraged to use dildos on themselves to reduce their inherent transphobia.
And the terrifying result, as the text notes, is that 7 of these blatantly hoax papers were formally accepted for publication by leading journals in the field of gender studies.
For the author, this proves the existence of the cartel mechanism perfectly.
Right. The entire field has no objective standards for truth or scientific rigor. Their only requirement for publication is strict adherence to ideological conformity.
So the author frames this entire process as a syllogistic trap.
Here's the mechanism.
Universities produce thousands of graduates trained exclusively in this feminist grievance ideology.
Those graduates need jobs, so they move into human resources and administrative roles in corporations and government bureaucracies across the country.
Once in HR, they control hiring parameters, internal corporate policy, and diversity initiatives.
Boom. The trap snaps shut. You have successfully bypassed democratic accountability entirely.
You have fundamentally changed how society operates without a single citizen ever casting a vote for these policies.
Exactly.
But again, I find myself wrestling with the scale of this.
How so?
The book describes this as a highly coordinated, intentional battle plan, a literal march. But is this an actual conspiracy with a master blueprint in a smoky back room?
Or is it emergent?
Yeah, is it just an emergent behavior, like a flock of birds all turning in the same direction, simply because they're like-minded people who naturally congregated in the same academic departments?
This is a debate the text anticipates. The author's argument leans heavily toward the intentionality of the movement, particularly when he shifts his focus from the ivory tower of academia to the cold, hard realities of the legal system.
Right, the law.
The book asserts that whether it initially started as a decentralized emergent behavior or not is irrelevant, because it rapidly hardened into deliberate, highly codified state policy specifically designed to presume male guilt.
Which brings us to his devastating critique of the criminal justice system. So if this ideological capture started in the universities, how did it end up putting people in handcuffs?
That jump from the classroom to the courtroom is what the text looks at next.
And it focuses on frameworks like the 1981 Duluth model for domestic violence. This was created by an activist named Ellen Pence in Duluth, Minnesota.
And the author points out an incredible piece of evidence here.
Ellen Pence herself admitted in a 1999 interview that the entire framework was built on ideological presuppositions.
We need to look at the exact mechanism of the Duluth model to understand the author's critique. Before this model, police response to domestic disturbances was highly discretionary.
Officers had to assess the situation.
Right. But the Duluth model standardized the response. However, the author points out that the model was designed with the predetermined conclusion that domestic violence is exclusively a tool of patriarchal terrorism.
That men are inherently the oppressors and women are inherently the victims.
It completely ignored and suppressed the work of leading sociologists like Dr. Murray Strauss.
Who spent decades accumulating massive data sets proving that domestic violence is frequently bilateral, meaning it is initiated by women at roughly the same rates as men.
So how does that flawed model actually work in practice?
Let's use an analogy. It's like a doctor diagnosing you with a severe disease before they even draw your blood or run a single test, simply based on your family history.
The protocol dictates the diagnosis before the evidence is even gathered.
Exactly. Under the Duluth model, when police arrive at a chaotic domestic disturbance, the protocol effectively mandates that the male is presumed to be the primary physical aggressor, almost regardless of the nuanced physical reality of the situation.
Even if he has defensive scratches on his face, the framework trains officers to view her actions as defensive and his presence as intimidating.
This presumption of guilt, the text argues, birthed a massive, weaponized false allegation industry.
The book then traces how this presumption of guilt scaled up into what it calls campus tribunals.
The prime example used is the infamous 2014 Rolling Stone article titled "A Rape on Campus."
This was the explosive story regarding a student named Jackie Coakley at the University of Virginia.
It was a story that turned out to be a complete and total fabrication.
Exactly. But the author argues that the real scandal wasn't just the catastrophic journalistic malpractice by Rolling Stone.
The deeper revelation was that UVA's entire administrative apparatus, guided by Dean Nicole Eramo, had been structurally designed to automatically presume male guilt the moment an allegation was made.
The mechanisms of standard due process, the right to cross-examine an accuser, the right to see the evidence against you, the presumption of innocence, were entirely dismantled.
Accused students had no right to a meaningful defense, and the accuser's uncorroborated word was treated as absolute sacred text.
And the book scales this argument all the way up to the highest, most visible levels of the United States government.
Citing the 2018 Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh and the allegations brought forward by Christine Blasey Ford.
The text highlights how the media matrix and a massive portion of the political establishment were entirely willing to enthusiastically dismantle the foundational evidentiary standard of Western jurisprudence.
The presumption of innocence.
And they were willing to do it based on uncorroborated claims from 36 years prior, leaning on things like polygraph tests, which are strictly inadmissible in federal court precisely because they are scientifically unreliable.
The author views this not as an isolated partisan political circus, but as the terrifying logical endpoint of feminist theory being successfully transmuted into beminding legal reality.
The argument here is that the system operates identically at the micro level of a college campus and the macro level of the Supreme Court.
The overarching thesis is that you cannot navigate a legal system if the burden of proof is fundamentally inverted.
But if that is the case, if you are presumed guilty the moment an accusation is leveled, is there even a point in participating in the system?
According to the text, participating in the traditional structures of family and marriage under these legal conditions is an act of profound financial and emotional peril.
This leads directly into the author's exploration of family courts. If the criminal justice system is designed to presume male guilt, the author argues that the family court system has been explicitly mechanically designed for the absolute financial and biological extraction of men.
Extraction is a heavy word, but it's the exact word the text uses.
It starts by analyzing what it terms biological extraction or reproductive tyranny.
The book cites a World Health Organization's statistic stating there are 73 million abortions globally every single year.
But the author isn't making a traditional religious or pro-life argument here.
No, his focus is laser targeted on the unilateral legal power dynamics involved.
The mechanism of the law dictates that women have absolute unilateral power over life and death regarding a pregnancy.
A woman can legally choose to terminate a father's child, completely ignoring his grief, his resources, or his desperate desire to be a parent. And the state backs her up 100%.
The author then highlights the inverse scenario to demonstrate the legal double standard.
If the woman unilaterally chooses to carry the child to term against the man's wishes, even if conception involved deception regarding birth control, the man has absolutely no equivalent legal right to a financial abortion.
He cannot legally sever his responsibility.
He is immediately placed on the hook for up to 2 decades of state-enforced financial support, regardless of his consent to become a parent.
The text argues this is a profound violation of bodily and financial autonomy that only applies to one sex.
From biological extraction, the book moves into a granular breakdown of financial extraction, dissecting what it calls the divorce industrial complex.
It traces the origin of this complex back to the introduction of no-fault divorce laws.
Before no fault, you had to prove a breach of the marriage contract, like infidelity or abuse, to dissolve the legal partnership.
No-fault allowed dissolution for any reason or no reason at all. And what was the statistical result of this legal shift?
The text points out that women now initiate approximately 70% of all divorces in the US and the UK.
The author argues that this is not because men are uniformly terrible husbands, but because the legal system heavily incentivizes the destruction of marriages for the initiating party.
The mechanism of this incentive is the family court apparatus. The text argues that the initiating party, statistically the wife, can reasonably expect to utilize the court to walk away with half of the marital assets.
Primary physical custody of the children and a claim on the man's future labor via alimony or spousal support.
The author points out the staggering statistics regarding alimony. Roughly 98% of all alimony recipients are female.
He asks a pointed rhetorical question.
If modern feminism has achieved profound economic independence for women, where are the advocates demanding that financially successful women pay alimony to support their lower-earning ex-husbands at equal rates?
And the mechanisms the courts use to extract this wealth are incredibly invasive.
The book spends time explaining the QDRO, the Qualified Domestic Relations Order.
Let's explain how this actually works. A QDRO is a specific legal order issued by a state court that forces a retirement plan administrator to parse out a portion of a worker's retirement account to an ex-spouse.
The author describes this as a government-sanctioned wealth transfer machine.
A man can work for 30 years, diligently funding his 401k, and a family court judge can literally sign a piece of paper that raids that protected federal account to pay out the spouse who unilaterally chose to dissolve the marital contract.
The text goes even further, detailing how the state will eagerly suspend a man's basic constitutional rights and his ability to survive in order to enforce this wealth transfer.
The author cites federal mandates that require all 50 states to implement programs that automatically suspend the driver's licenses,
including commercial driver's licenses, or CDLs, of men who fall behind on their child support payments.
The mechanism of that penalty is a literal catch-22. It is bureaucratic madness.
Let's say a man is a long-haul trucker. He hits hard times, maybe a medical emergency, and falls into arrears on his support payments.
The state responds by suspending his CDL.
But if he loses his CDL, he legally cannot drive his rig. If he can't drive his rig, he loses his job and his entire source of income.
Which means he now has absolutely zero ability to earn the money required to pay the debt that caused the state to suspend his license in the first place.
He is trapped in a punitive, inescapable loop. The author identifies this entire system as a perfect moral inversion.
The text describes it as a double bind. The paradox is that the men who do exactly what society demands of them,
The men who work grueling hours, who buy the house, who fund the retirement accounts, who successfully embody the traditional provider role.
these exact men unknowingly transform themselves into the most lucrative, vulnerable targets for financial extraction by the family court system.
I hear the argument, and the mechanics of the CDL suspension are undeniably brutal. But let me play devil's advocate here to test the author's theory of intentional malice.
Okay, let's test it.
The book argues that the family court system is explicitly, purposefully designed by feminist legislators to punish men and extract their wealth. Right. But couldn't we look at this through a less conspiratorial lens? Could it be that family law is just a really clumsy, massively outdated bureaucratic machine that is desperately trying to enforce child welfare?
You're saying maybe it's not malicious?
Exactly. Maybe it's not a malicious wealth transfer machine, but just a horribly blunt, inefficient instrument trying to ensure that children don't starve when a household fractures.
The text anticipates exactly that counterargument. The author's response is that to understand the true intent of the system, we cannot look at the courts in a vacuum.
We have to look at the broader context.
We must look at how the media and corporate narrative operate in tandem to justify and shield this system from reform.
The book argues that the media matrix actively and knowingly distorts economic reality to maintain the illusion of systemic female victimhood.
This illusion provides the essential moral cover for the extractive legal systems to operate.
The logic is, if this were purely about child welfare and objective truth, the media would not need to constantly manipulate labor data to keep men perpetually on the defensive.
Right, the media matrix.
Mhm.
And the book goes straight for the throat on what is arguably the most famous statistic in modern gender politics.
The 77-cent wage gap myth.
We have all heard this a million times, the claim that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes for doing the exact same work.
But the text cites the work of Claudia Golden, a Harvard economist who published exhaustive research in 2014 that utterly dismantled this talking point.
We need to explain the mechanism of Golden's research because it is central to the author's point about media distortion.
When the media repeats the 77-cent statistic, they are taking the absolute median earnings of all full-time working women and comparing it to the absolute median earnings of all full-time working men.
Completely ignoring what jobs they're actually doing.
Golden's research showed that when you adjust the data for continuous career trajectories, meaning no multi-year gaps in employment, and critically, when you adjust for actual hours worked per week, the wage gap virtually disappears.
The book cites Bureau of Labor Statistics data showing that full-time working men work an average of 8.2 hours a day.
Compared to full-time working women, who average 7.8 hours a day.
Now, 0.4 hours a day doesn't sound like much on a Tuesday.
But the text explains the compounding mechanism. Over a week, a month, a year, and a 30-year career, that slight daily difference compounds into thousands and thousands of extra hours of labor, overtime pay, and resulting seniority.
The author argues this is fundamentally a matter of different economic choices and biological realities, not systemic patriarchal discrimination.
Statistically, women are more likely to prioritize flexible working hours or to take multi-year absences from the workforce for child rearing.
These choices drastically impact long-term seniority and peak earning potential.
The text points out the glaring logical absurdity of the systemic discrimination hypothesis.
If capitalist employers could genuinely get the exact same quality and quantity of labor output from female employees for 23% less pay, profit-maximizing corporations would exclusively hire women.
The fact that corporate America doesn't do this proves mathematically that the 77-cent figure is an intellectually dishonest manipulation of raw data.
The book even brings up a hilarious real-world example of this narrative backfiring.
The BBC gender pay gap revelation.
The British Broadcasting Corporation was under massive pressure to prove they weren't discriminating, so they conducted a massive internal audit of their payroll.
And the audit accidentally exposed that multiple high-profile male presenters are actually being paid substantially less than their female counterparts for equivalent work.
Yet, as the text notes, the overarching media narrative regarding systemic female oppression never shifted.
The author uses this to illustrate how the media acts as a funhouse mirror.
They take raw economic data, they completely distort it by removing all context regarding hours worked or occupational hazards, they mold it to fit a predetermined victimhood narrative.
And they essentially memory hole the original nuanced numbers.
And if you attempt to point out these statistical discrepancies in the digital public square, the book shows exactly how the mechanisms of censorship operate to silence you.
The text points to the massive Reddit purge that occurred in June of 2020.
In a single sweep, the platform banned around 2,000 subreddits, which included the largest and most prominent men's rights and male support communities on the internet.
But crucially, the author notes that openly anti-male subreddits, which routinely violated terms of service with hate speech, were left perfectly intact.
The book ties this cultural censorship directly into the revelations of the 2023 Twitter files, which definitively prove the existence of internal shadow banning mechanisms.
Literally, algorithms designed to invisibly suppress the reach of dissenting voices that challenge the prevailing institutional narratives.
The text also extends this critique of the media matrix into the realm of corporate advertising.
The author conducts an analysis of high-visibility advertising, such as Super Bowl commercials.
He notes a deliberate, calculated, decades-long trend of humiliating male characters.
Fathers and husbands are routinely portrayed as bumbling, incompetent, emotionally stunted, or foolish, requiring the competent, exacerbated female character to solve the problem.
The author argues this is a calculated strategy to pander to female consumers, who drive the vast majority of household spending.
The conclusion the book draws here is that the media and the sprawling diversity industrial complex are essentially running a massive, highly lucrative grift.
By actively ignoring the deadly realities of male occupational hazards, the glass cellar we talked about, and hyper-focusing public outrage on a mathematically debunked wage gap and boardroom quotas.
They maintain a perpetual victimhood narrative. And that narrative is exactly what justifies the multi-billion-dollar funding of their NGOs, their political action committees, and their sprawling corporate HR departments.
But this raises an essential question about corporate behavior.
Exactly. This is where I struggle to understand the corporate compliance.
Why do they play along?
Yeah, why does corporate America play along with this? I mean, surely the ultimate god of a Fortune 500 company is profit, right?
You'd think so.
If the 77-cent wage gap is statistically false, and if deliberately humiliating men in your advertising campaigns alienates roughly half of your potential customer base, why do these massive corporations continually bow down to this ideology?
Why do they fund the HR departments that enforce it?
Right.
The author provides a specific answer to this in his examination of international governance.
He argues that domestic corporations play along because the ideological capture isn't just local, it is a global apparatus reinforced by the highest echelons of international authority.
For a domestic corporation, it is simply cheaper and safer to comply to pay what the author calls the diversity tax by funding these HR departments and adopting these messaging strategies than to face the catastrophic PR nightmare and legal wrath of being targeted by this global network.
This part of the text genuinely made my jaw drop because it explains the mechanism of how global consensus is quite literally manufactured out of thin air.
The author maps out what he calls a circular citation network.
Let's break down how this trick works. You have a massive global entity like UN Women. They publish a terrifying report on gender inequality, and to back it up, they cite data from the World Health Organization.
Okay, sounds authoritative.
But then you look at the WHO report, and where did they get their data? They cite statistics provided by UN Women.
And where did both of these global behemoths get the raw data in the first place?
They cite independent feminist NGOs that receive their primary funding directly from UN Women and the WHO.
It is a perfectly closed loop echo chamber.
The mechanism is brilliant in its deception. By endlessly citing each other, they mathematically manufacture the illusion of a massive, robust, global scientific consensus.
This network effectively buries any counter data that might highlight male disadvantage because the data simply cannot enter the circular citation loop.
The book pulls out some damning statistics to prove what this global blind spot looks like in reality.
It examines the International Labor Organization's 2022 report on modern forced labor.
The report estimates that an unfathomable 27.6 million people are trapped in forced labor globally.
The data shows that these victims are predominantly male, trapped in brutal conditions in construction, unregulated manufacturing, and deep-sea fishing.
Yet the text points out that the vast, overwhelming majority of international policy attention, UN speeches, and billions in funding flows almost exclusively to NGOs focused on female sex trafficking.
The author is not minimizing the horror of sex trafficking. He is highlighting a catastrophic disparity in institutional empathy.
The millions of enslaved men dying in rock quarries and fishing fleets are rendered essentially invisible to the global conscience because their suffering does not align with the narrative generated by the circular citation network.
And the book brings this all to a head with a modern, undeniable geopolitical example of global systemic misandry.
The war in Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, as the invasion began, the Ukrainian government implemented a total absolute border exit ban on all male citizens aged 18 to 60.
The author describes it as a gendered iron curtain dropping across the country.
The mechanism of state violence was applied exclusively to one sex. Women were free to flee to safety across borders as refugees, while men were condemned by law to stay and defend the territory or die under the threat of military coercion.
The text points out the staggering, deafening hypocrisy of the global reaction to this policy.
Western feminist organizations and politicians who have spent decades screaming themselves hoarse, demanding absolute bodily autonomy and dismantling gender roles, either celebrated this policy as necessary or remained completely silent.
They found absolutely no ideological or moral issue with state-sanctioned military coercion, the ultimate violation of bodily autonomy, so long as the victims of that coercion were exclusively men.
This is the moment where the author brilliantly ties the entire historical narrative together.
He draws a direct, unbroken line from the deck of the HMS Birkenhead in 1852, directly to the Ukrainian border checkpoints in 2022.
His overarching argument is that the fundamental nature of the international order has not evolved or changed its core operating system.
It still structurally treats male life and male sacrifice as a natural, entirely expendable public resource, while treating female inconvenience or danger as a paramount humanitarian crisis.
The only difference is that today, this ancient biological sacrificial system operates under the cynical guise of a modern equality movement.
Which brings us to the culmination of the text, where the author shifts from diagnosis to prescription.
The book has painstakingly laid out this terrifying, inescapable matrix of biological instinct, academic capture, legal traps, and global media distortion.
The question becomes, what is the author's roadmap for surviving a system he deems entirely hostile?
His answer is radical. He argues that the first necessary step is achieving what he calls gnosis, an ancient Greek term referring to hidden or forbidden knowledge.
He says men must first completely wake up and see the systemic mechanics for what they actually are, stripping away the cultural gaslighting.
And once you have that clarity, you cannot try to fight the system directly. You have to build defensive legal architectures. You essentially have to turn your life into a legal fortress.
Exactly. The core of his advice is based on a bleak assessment. You cannot reform a captured system.
The institutions are too far gone, and the biological empathy gap is too ingrained to ever vote your way out of it.
Therefore, the text argues, men must focus entirely on becoming what the legal world calls judgment-proof.
Let's explain the mechanism of being judgment-proof.
To be judgment-proof in this context means structuring your assets, your relationships, and your legal standing in such a way that it costs the state or a hostile partner vastly more time, money, and legal effort to attack you than they could ever hope to yield in financial extraction.
You make yourself a hardened target. And the text provides highly specific, granular legal precedents as a blueprint for this architecture.
Yeah, he gets incredibly detailed. First, he tackles the institution of marriage, the prenup.
But not just any prenup. The book cites a specific 2021 decision from the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, Anson v. Crane Martin.
The author breaks down how this ruling protects financial autonomy. The mechanism here is transparency and independent counsel.
The text explains that if a prenuptial agreement is executed with absolute financial transparency from both sides, and both parties have independent legal representation, this precedent ensures that the contract holds up like iron against future attempts by a family court judge to raid a man's premarital assets or compel unfair alimony.
But the author goes further, acknowledging that many men, having achieved gnosis, will simply refuse to enter the legal contract of marriage at all.
For them, he details a cohabitation contract architecture. The text points to the famous California precedent, Marvin II, often referred to as the palimony case.
Let's walk through how a man would actually use this cohabitation contract in a modern relationship.
If you move in with a partner, family courts in many jurisdictions can eventually try to treat you as common law married, exposing your assets to division if the relationship ends.
The mechanism to defeat this is a formal, notarized cohabitation agreement.
This contract explicitly dictates, in legally binding terms, exactly who pays for the rent, the groceries, the utilities, and explicitly states that no mixing of financial assets is occurring and no expectation of future support exists.
By doing this, the author argues, you completely remove your relationship and your assets from the draconian discretionary jurisdiction of the family court system and place it squarely in the realm of standard contract law.
The book also provides a defensive blueprint against the false allegation industry and the presumption of guilt we discussed earlier.
The author advises building an order of protection defense. He cites the 2018 Commonwealth v. FK precedent in Massachusetts.
This case established a vital legal mechanism. It required that actual corroborating evidence must be presented beyond mere bare allegations to sustain a long-term restraining order.
The book's advice is to meticulously document your life, keep logs, record interactions in one-party consent states, save every text message so that you possess the corroborating evidence necessary to trigger this precedent and crush a fabricated order of protection before it ruins your life.
And finally, to combat what the author previously termed reproductive tyranny, the text outlines a highly controversial legal framework for issuing financial abortion notices.
The author references the 2020 Wisconsin legal case, in re paternity of TT.
The mechanism suggested here involves legally documenting, prior to any conception, a man's explicit lack of consent to fatherhood or financial support, utilizing contract principles to attempt to protect his financial autonomy if he is subjected to reproductive deception.
The author is basically advising men to construct a subterranean legal bunker.
Draft the ironclad prenup, sign the notarized cohabitation contract, keep a digital log of your entire life, wear a body cam in your own home.
But this leads to my absolute final, biggest challenge to the author's entire thesis.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a man has to spend his entire life wearing legal Kevlar in his own living room, constantly anticipating that his partner is going to drop a tactical nuclear weapon on his finances and his freedom, Has he actually achieved sovereignty?
Or has he just surrendered the culture entirely, accepting a miserable life of constant grinding paranoia?
It is a profound philosophical question. The author would likely counter that challenge by arguing that true sovereignty in a demonstrably hostile environment requires acknowledging the absolute reality of the threat.
If you are walking through an active war zone, wearing Kevlar isn't paranoia. It is the bare minimum requirement for survival.
The text asserts that you cannot live freely in a fantasy world where the laws are fair when the data proves they are not.
The author believes that only by millions of men making themselves legally and financially untouchable can they starve the extractive system of its fuel, eventually forcing it to collapse under its own bureaucratic weight.
And that concept of starving the system brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over today.
At the end of the text, the author calls for a masculine renaissance. This renaissance is built entirely on fraternal bonds and men choosing to step completely outside of this captured system.
But I want you to really think about the mechanics of this hypothetical. If millions of men actually read this book, achieve this gnosis, and take his advice to completely opt out, what happens?
They refuse traditional marriage, they abandon corporate ambition because they refuse to pay the diversity tax, they stop striving to provide taxable wealth for a state that hates them, and they just walk away to protect their peace.
If that happens, you face a chilling economic and social reality. Based on the author's own statistics in the very first chapter, this is a civilization that relies almost exclusively on male sacrifice, male physical labor, and male taxation to function.
Exactly. If the glass cellar empties out because the workers finally refuse to participate in a system that offers them zero legal protections and zero cultural empathy, what happens to the infrastructure?
What happens when the lights literally go out, the water stops running, and the bridges start collapsing because the pig class finally ran out of disposable men to do the dying?
It is a wild, terrifying scenario to imagine, and it fundamentally forces you to rethink the hidden structural pillars holding up our daily lives.
If you want to dive into the raw data, read the actual court cases, and explore the full, unvarnished scope of these arguments for yourself, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and buy Pig Class, Feminism's Superior Citizens.
And if you want to bypass the digital gatekeepers we discussed and hear more directly from the author regarding these legal strategies, you should follow him at Conrad Riker on Substack, find him at Conrad Riker on Twitter, and search Conrad Riker on YouTube.
That is all the time we have for this deep dive today.
Thank you for joining us on this massive exploration. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a 5-star review for the show if you want us to keep tackling these hard-hitting, complex topics. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will see you on the next deep dive.